Hello. Once a month on The Heat, we sit down with a panel of our fellow journalists and take a look at some of the headlines grabbing the stories. Joining our round table from Havana is Cristina Escobar, Cuban journalist, and Wang Guan here in the studio is our Chief Political Correspondent for CCTV's Mandarin service from Sao Paulo. In Brazil, we have Sam Cowie, a freelance journalist who has worked for Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, and many others. And a friend of the show, Richard Fowler, is here in the studio, host of his own nationally syndicated radio show, The Richard Fowler Show. Thanks so much for joining us all around these datelines. Cristina, I want to start with you in Havana. Historic announcement, obviously, that US President Barack Obama will be the first US president in some 80 years to visit Cuba. How's this going down in Cuba?
Well, it's going to be very interesting, this visit. As you just said, 88 years ago was the last and only visit of a president in exercise to visit this country. Calvin Coolidge actually was in 1928, and now we're having Barack Obama here for 2 whole days, 21st and 22nd. It's going to be quite interesting. He says he wants to know the Cuban reality, and that's quite an opportunity because shows that it's possible to come to Cuba, that it's possible for a U.S. president to come to Cuba, and it's a way to push his legacy about this new relation between Cuba and the U.S., which is not over, taking into consideration the embargo is still in place and has a lot of opponents, people against this policy inside the U.S. But it's quite an interesting perspective. He is going to be very welcomed. He's well known in Cuba, and of course we Cubans are very excited that this is also an acknowledge of our system, of our country, and also about how we're dealing things with the world and with the U.S.
Cristina, I want to follow up. I was lucky enough to be in Havana, as you know, when the flag was raised at the U.S. Embassy, when diplomatic relations were restored. But this is a step further. What's the average Cuban on the street in Havana thinking ahead of this visit? And what are they expecting from this new relationship with the United States?
Well, there's it could be narrowed down to 2 positions. First of all, excitement, because there are 2 million Cubans in the U.S. and it's too close, we're too close to be that kind of enemies. And it's quite important to feel that we are in a more comfortable position now with the U.S. But the other position, I would say, and it has reasons in our history, has to do with certain reluctancy there is still to trust to the U.S., to trust to the intentions that the U.S. has with this new relation with Cuba. And if this new policy means that it will mean that the U.S. government and the U.S. interest would respect the Cuban government, the Cuban sovereignty, and the decision of 11 million Cubans like me that live here in this island, and not just try to change Cuba because they just want to do it. They have to consult the essential things that Cuba has to change. It's up to the Cubans, not to the U.S. And that kind of dialogue is not still very clear. But I would say that in general, the visit of the President Barack Obama would push good intentions in both ways. In those people that believe this is a good thing, and also the people that are still a little reluctant to believe that the U.S. has very good intentions with Cuba. There's a lot of opportunities, and the idea is to take advantage of those opportunities, even though, of course, there are always risks. In this new relation, Cuba has never had normal relations with the U.S., and that's something we will have to invent in the future. Also this week, President Barack Obama here in the U.S. saying that he wants to close Guantanamo Bay prison again. His final chance, perhaps, after pledging to close it within his first year of office, is going to go into his 8th year of office. Does he have a chance?
Yeah, I think he definitely has a chance to close it this time around. I think what was holding him up over and over again was obstruction in the United States Congress. But let's talk about...
That's still there, right?
It's still there, but I think he'll get over it this time. But let's talk about the facts in this closing of Guantanamo Bay, is that George Bush had released a good majority of the prisoners prior to the president even taking office. From when the election started, the campaign started, when George was still in the White House till Obama was sworn in, about 400 of the prisoners were already released back to their home countries.
There's 91 left now.
Right, so there's a very, very small number left. I do believe before the president leaves this White House on January 20th, 2017, you will see Guantanamo Bay closed.
Wang Guan, you know, internationally, Guantanamo Bay has been a thorn on the side of America's established position of being pro-human rights across the world. What is China and the region thinking about it?
Well, actually, in fact, some people may not realize this, but China has a stake in it. You know, think about it. China's western restive Uyghur region China has some of its nationals held up in the Guantanamo Bay and then did not go through a fair trial. So basically, if you listen to China's foreign ministry, and their position was this was a double standard for the U.S. You know, when there was a mass theater shooting here, for example, domestically, people get the Miranda's rights, they get the due process, whereas a foreign national who was suspected of committing terrorism was tried in a military court. So oftentimes you hear Beijing asking, how would America feel if their own citizens were tried in another country's military trial without the Miranda's rights, the due process?
And Spain's attempts to arrest Donald Rumsfeld and others goes into that. Cristina, obviously this looks very interesting from where you are in Havana. Guantanamo Bay, the base, of course, is on Cuban soil, a complicated relationship. They want to close the prison, but there's no real movement on the U.S. giving that base back to Cuba, which of course is a big issue for national sovereignty there.
Well, that's quite interesting because in all that discussion about the prison and the prisoners and the human rights issues about Guantanamo, no one talks that actually Guantanamo Bay is in a territory that the Cuban government is being reclaiming that is Cuban and not from the U.S. to just do whatever the U.S. government wants. And this is quite one of the problems and one of the steps that has to be taken care of in order to normalize relations has to do with the blockade, with embargo, but also with the territory illegally occupied. That's what the Cuban government says in Guantanamo. Actually, and you were talking about Donald Trump, he showed that he doesn't know anything about foreign policy when he said that Cuba was cashing checks paid by the U.S. by that territory. Actually, the U.S. pays, but the Cuban government doesn't cash those checks because they don't recognize the existence and actually they occupying illegally of this territory.
Let's move on to China now, because we had a really quite interesting and historic visit by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, here to the U.S. It's the third time he's met with John Kerry or people higher than that in just a matter of weeks. Huge shuttle diplomacy. Of course, the result was this united resolution against the DPRK's nuclear ambitions. Wang Guan, you've been following this story all the time. What was the takeaway from this visit?
You can tell that meeting 3 times in a month, the State Department and China's Foreign Ministry have a cordial, have a good personal as well as professional working relationship. It really helps them solve some issues. But this is really a two-track relationship. On the diplomatic and the economic side, like I said, they have good personal relationships on the leadership level, as well as good professional dialogue mechanisms. But on the security side, you hear Secretary Carter of the Pentagon specifying China as the most stressing competitor, and also Commander Harris of PACOM has hostile remarks. The
Pacific Command leader. Yeah, it's very interesting because you have two powers coming together to really chart the way forward on sanctions with DPRK and their nuclear ambitions, which was quite impressive considering the differences they have on this issue anyway. And then this South China Sea issue keeps on cropping up. And of course, the US says that China is militarizing the South China Sea. But from the Chinese point of view, it's the US that are stepping up military action in the South China Sea. That's right.
Well, here's the thing. I'm sure in the classroom of Vietnamese students or Filipino students or the Chinese students, they all hand a map out there, showing those territories are their own. But the thing is, what China feels that at least the U.S. should recognize that there are more than one claimants to those territories, and U.S.
sometimes
should
5 or 6.
Yeah. The U.S. should stick to what it says. That is, it does not take sides with regard to sovereignty. But Commander Harris of PACOM said specifically that he does not believe that those islands belong to China, which is a deviation from the official U.S. position. So basically, the biggest issue China has is that the U.S. should at least be impartial.
Do you think there's any sign of consensus on this?
Well, basically from this trip, you see both Kerry and Wang Yi stating the positions they have been stating previously. Basically, they can only agree to disagree at this point on South China Sea.
I think this is the distinction. I think if you you couple with the president going to Cuba and you couple it with what you're seeing from the State Department our relationship with China, this is a complete shift in foreign policy from both George W. Bush and what the Republican candidates are saying on the field. What the president is committed to is not being the world's version of the Mean Girls and have real lasting conversation with folks, right? And the only way, and what the president understands and what John Kerry understands, is the only way we can truly create sustainable world peace is through dialogue and conversation, right? So in the case of South Korea, in the case of North Korea rather, we've got to talk to the Chinese to make sure we can really normalize that particular peninsula. In the case of Cuba, the president opening up travel is one step in the right direction to bring corporations in. The corporations are going to be the ones to move to get rid of the embargo. The farmers in Iowa, trust me, want this embargo gone so they can sell goods into Cuba. Marriott, Hyatt, every hotel is chomping at the bit to get into Cuba.
You know, I want to add quickly, 40% of the corns in Iowa that I just visited on the campaign trail are sold to the Chinese. So
Absolutely.
think about what the U.S.-China rapprochement gave the two sides. So people think that if the U.S. and Cuba can solve their issues,
But when it comes to
China,
China, Richard just talked about diplomacy, but when it comes to China, there has been a really sort of interesting defense and military response. This pivot was meant to be very diplomatic and economic, but a lot of people in the region see a military response as forefront, right?
Right, there are still 70,000 U.S. military troops in Okinawa, Japan, Korea, Philippines, and the Pentagon is really upgrading their capabilities and the forward deployment posture. So Beijing feels that, I know sometimes this really provoked Beijing to act in a way that it otherwise wouldn't. I mean, China is very, like any other country, very nationalistic sometimes. So if you provoked China and then encircle it, you might provoke it to act in a way.
And I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think what you're seeing from the United States, and I'm not saying I agree with the military buildup in the region, but I think the military buildup has less to do with Beijing and more to do with Pyongyang and really trying to get their hands around what is happening with Kim Jong-un and how do they sort of, at best, contain him, because he is it's one of the most likely scenarios of nuclear war globally. And I think his development of nuclear weapons and the fact that North Korea is so closed off to the rest of the world besides China is what the America sees as a problem that they've got to solve. And I think it's a top priority for the State Department.
I agree, but I think this communist China fear-mongering is still there. It's not out in the open, but it's still there. If you talk to the intelligence community, if they talk to you at all, and the military folks, the military folks, some of them, they still think that, I agree, North Korea might be a more imminent threat.